Isaiah, is that really you? Yeah, it's me, Calvin. Are you absolutely sure, sir? I am so sorry, Hayes. Isaiah didn't make it.
My commander said my best friend died in combat. 10 years later, I saw him alive. 10 years ago, Calvin Hayes stood at a military base and watched his best friend's name disappear from the living. His commander looked him in the eyes and said Isaiah was dead, killed in combat. Calvin believed him. He mourned Isaiah, carried the guilt, and eventually forced himself to move forward. But 10 years later, Calvin walked into a place he was never supposed to find, looked across a room, and saw the man he had buried in his heart standing there alive. Isaiah was older, thinner. His face carried years Calvin couldn't explain, but it was him. And when Calvin whispered his name, Isaiah didn't celebrate. He simply looked at him and said, "I've been waiting for you." What Calvin didn't know was that Isaiah's disappearance was only the first lie. The deeper Calvin searched, the more he discovered that his family, his military career, his memories, and even the story of Isaiah's death were connected to a hidden network that had been manipulating people's identities for generations. And the most shocking part? Calvin himself had once helped hide the truth. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Calvin and Isaiah had met long before either of them understood what secrets could cost. They grew up close enough to call each other brothers. Isaiah was the one person Calvin trusted without hesitation. When Calvin joined the military, Isaiah eventually followed. They served together, trained together, and survived enough difficult moments to believe nothing could separate them. Then came the mission that changed everything. Calvin remembered the night clearly. The orders were brief. Their unit was sent into a dangerous area where intelligence suggested an enemy position was operating. Calvin and Isaiah moved together, as they always had. Then the operation went wrong. Gunfire erupted. The unit scattered. Calvin remembered losing sight of Isaiah. He remembered shouting his name. Then he remembered being pulled away. Hours later, Calvin was informed that Isaiah had been killed. There was no body for him to identify. No final conversation. No chance to say goodbye. His commander told him the military had confirmed the death. Calvin wanted to believe there had been a mistake, but the official records eventually supported the story. Isaiah was listed as dead. Calvin went home carrying a grief he couldn't explain. For years, he kept one photograph of them together. Sometimes he looked at it and wondered whether he should have gone back, whether he could have saved Isaiah, whether his best friend had been alive somewhere during those first few hours after the mission. Eventually, the questions became too painful. Calvin accepted the story. Isaiah was dead. Then, 10 years later, everything changed. Calvin received an anonymous message containing an old military reference number. It belonged to Isaiah. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. Then another message arrived. This time, it contained a photograph. Calvin stared at the image for several seconds before his body went cold. The man in the photograph looked older, but there was no mistaking him. Isaiah was alive. Calvin began searching. The trail led him through old records, abandoned facilities, and people who became nervous whenever Isaiah's name was mentioned. One of those people was Price, a former intelligence contractor who told Calvin that some military deaths were not what they appeared to be. Calvin asked what she meant. Price refused to explain. She only told him, "If Isaiah is alive, someone wanted you to believe he wasn't." Then Price disappeared. Calvin found another clue connected to a man named Gaines. Gaines knew about a hidden archive containing records of people who had been relocated, hidden, or declared dead. Calvin thought the archive might explain Isaiah. Instead, it opened the door to something much bigger. The records showed that Isaiah wasn't the only person who had vanished. There were hundreds of names. Some belonged to witnesses. Some belonged to military personnel. Some belonged to people who had apparently died but had later appeared under different identities. Calvin began to understand that someone had built a system capable of erasing people without leaving an obvious trace. But why would Isaiah be part of it? Calvin eventually followed the trail to an abandoned facility. That was where he found Isaiah, alive. For a few seconds, neither man moved. 10 years disappeared in that silence. Calvin finally whispered, "Dad." No, that wasn't the word he meant. It was Isaiah.
Is that really you?
Isaiah stared at him and said,
Calvin.
"You remember me." Calvin told him he had never forgotten him. Isaiah answered, "That's what they wanted you to believe."
I was there
Calvin
that night,
demanded to know
Calvin.
what happened. Isaiah told him he hadn't died.
They planned the whole
He had been
thing.
taken. His
Are you telling
identity
me the
had been
truth?
erased, and everyone around Calvin had been instructed to accept the official story. Calvin asked who gave the order. Isaiah said, "Your family." That answer destroyed whatever certainty Calvin had left. Isaiah explained that Calvin's family had been connected to a secret protection network. It had originally been created to protect witnesses and people whose lives were in danger. But powerful individuals eventually learned how to exploit it. People could be hidden. Records could be changed. Identities could disappear. Isaiah had discovered the system and became a threat. Calvin asked whether his own father had known. Isaiah said yes. Calvin asked whether his mother knew. Isaiah said yes. Calvin asked whether Darius knew. Isaiah hesitated. Your brother knew more than you think. Calvin immediately contacted Darius. The conversation was tense. Darius admitted that he had known Isaiah was alive for a period of time, but he had been ordered to keep quiet. Calvin asked why. Darius said because the people behind the network had threatened the entire family. Calvin refused to accept that as an excuse. Then Darius revealed something even more shocking. Calvin had another brother. His name was Caleb. Caleb had been separated from the family when they were young and raised inside the same system. Calvin didn't understand why nobody had ever told him. Darius explained that Caleb had been trained to imitate Calvin. His voice, his movements, his signature. The system had intended to use Caleb as a substitute identity if Calvin ever became a problem. Calvin eventually met Caleb and immediately noticed something unsettling. Caleb knew things about him that only family should know. Childhood memories, small habits, private details. But Caleb didn't remember everything. His memories had been manipulated too. 3 brothers had been turned into pieces of the same secret. Darius possessed one part of the information. Caleb possessed another. Calvin unknowingly carried the final part. Together, they could reconstruct the hidden archive. But there was one more person connected to the puzzle. Isaiah. The system had used Isaiah because he was the person Calvin trusted most. His disappearance wasn't simply meant to remove a witness. It was designed to isolate Calvin and eventually trigger memories that had been buried inside him. Calvin began remembering fragments of his childhood. Games his mother had taught him. Numbers he thought were meaningless. Stories that suddenly seemed like codes. He realized his mother had trained him to memorize pieces of the archive without telling him what they meant. His father had done the same. The family hadn't simply hidden information on computers or paper. They had hidden portions of it inside their own memories. Then Calvin found an old photograph that changed everything. It showed the hospital where he was born. On the back was the date of his birth. Calvin went there with Isaiah, Darius, and Caleb. Inside the abandoned building, memories began returning. Calvin remembered his mother. He remembered Darius. He remembered Caleb. And then he remembered something nobody had told him. There had been another person involved. A man named Elias Hayes. His grandfather. Calvin had always believed Elias was dead. He wasn't. Elias appeared in the hospital and finally admitted that he was the man known as the founder. But the founder wasn't simply a title. It was the person who controlled the hidden network. Elias had created the version of the system that Calvin knew. He claimed he had originally wanted to protect people. But power had changed the mission. The network became a tool capable of making people disappear. Elias admitted that he had allowed Isaiah to be taken because Isaiah knew too much. Calvin asked why Isaiah had been allowed to return. Elias answered, "Because I needed you to remember." Calvin realized that his entire search might have been engineered. The clues had been placed where he would find them. The people he trusted had guided him toward Isaiah. The system had been waiting for Calvin to reconstruct the archive himself. But Elias wasn't the only person controlling events. Someone else had stolen the network. Someone known only as the director. The director had modernized the system and connected it to databases, surveillance systems, military communications, and financial records. He didn't want to protect people. He wanted information because information created power. Calvin asked Elias who the director was. Elias refused to answer. Then the director appeared on a screen. He told Calvin that his grandfather had been foolish to believe one family could control such a powerful system. The director believed the network should belong to whoever was strong enough to control it. Calvin saw the truth clearly. His family had spent generations fighting over the same weapon, and Isaiah had been caught in the middle. But the director revealed something that nearly broke Calvin. Calvin's father appeared beside him, alive. Calvin couldn't believe what he was seeing. His father looked directly at him and said, "I'm sorry, son." Calvin demanded to know whether he was the founder. His father said no. Then he admitted that he had ordered Isaiah's disappearance. Calvin's entire body went cold. The man he had spent 10 years believing was dead had been alive. His father had been alive too, and his father had been involved. Calvin demanded to know why. His father answered, "Because you asked me to." Calvin refused to believe him. Then the memories came back. 10 years earlier, before Isaiah disappeared, Calvin had discovered evidence that the archive existed. Isaiah had found documents proving someone was using Calvin's identity. Calvin realized that if Isaiah was captured, the network could use him to find the archive. Calvin's father had warned him that Isaiah was in danger. Calvin had made a terrible choice. He had agreed to disappear Isaiah to keep him alive. Then Calvin chose to erase his own memory of the decision. His father helped him. The false death was created so Calvin would stop searching. Isaiah was told Calvin had betrayed him. Calvin was told Isaiah had died. Both men were manipulated into believing they had lost each other. Calvin finally understood why Isaiah had been so angry. He had spent 10 years believing his best friend had abandoned him. Calvin had spent 10 years grieving a man who was still alive. Both had been victims of a decision Calvin himself had once made. But the story still wasn't over. When Calvin activated the archive, the system identified him as the founder's successor. Elias was stunned. Calvin had been designated to inherit the network years earlier. The authority had been hidden inside his identity and memories. Calvin now had the power everyone else had been fighting over. The director demanded that Calvin hand it over. Elias warned him that the network could expose thousands of innocent people if it was destroyed incorrectly. Calvin realized he had been given a choice no one before him had made. He could become the new founder, continue the system, and control the information. Or he could destroy the idea of the founder entirely. Calvin chose neither control nor destruction. He chose protection without secrecy. With Darius, Caleb, Isaiah, and his mother beside him, Calvin rewrote the access system. Evidence of crimes could be released. The identities of innocent witnesses could remain protected. No single person would control the entire network again. The system began shutting down. The director threatened Calvin. He warned him that people would die if the network disappeared. Calvin told him, "You had 10 years. I'm done letting you decide." Then Calvin pressed the final command. The Founder Network was terminated. Its evidence was distributed to independent investigators and authorities. Its most dangerous identity records were destroyed. For the first time in generations, nobody had complete control. But one final message appeared on the screen. One active founder node remains. Calvin froze. Elias knew what it meant. The original founder system had existed before him. His father had inherited part of it. Calvin had inherited another. And now the final authority was inside Calvin himself. Calvin had become the very thing his family had spent generations fighting over. But instead of accepting the position, he ended it. The evidence was released. The system collapsed. The people responsible for manipulating identities began facing investigation. Some were arrested. Some disappeared before authorities could reach them. Some victims finally received answers. Others never did. Calvin's father was taken into custody and questioned about his role. Elias was arrested. Gaines was eventually found alive. Price's disappearance was investigated. But the director was never identified. Calvin and Isaiah were left with something more difficult than revenge. They had to learn how to live again. Isaiah's military records were restored. His family was told the truth. He was no longer a dead man in the eyes of the world. But 10 years could not simply be returned. Isaiah had missed birthdays, holidays, friendships, ordinary mornings, and countless moments that could never be recreated. Calvin understood that. He didn't promise to make up for the lost years. He simply promised not to waste the years they still had. Darius eventually left the military. Caleb began building an identity that belonged to him instead of one created by the network. Calvin's mother admitted that she had spent years believing secrecy was the same thing as protection. Calvin told her that protecting someone without allowing them to choose could become another form of control. His father eventually admitted the same thing. Calvin didn't immediately forgive him. Some wounds needed time. But for the first time, his father accepted responsibility without trying to explain it away. Months later, Calvin and Isaiah sat together at a quiet restaurant. No surveillance. No missions. No hidden identities. Isaiah asked Calvin what he remembered about the day they met. Calvin smiled. "You stole my lunch." Isaiah laughed. "You still remember that?" Calvin said. Apparently, some memories were too stubborn to erase. They sat there laughing about something so ordinary that neither man wanted the moment to end. After everything they had survived, ordinary life had become precious. But 1 year after the Founder Network was destroyed, Calvin received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph. Calvin looked at it and froze. It showed 4 children standing together inside the hospital. Calvin, Darius, Caleb, and another boy. Calvin didn't recognize the 4th child. He showed the picture to his mother. The moment she saw it, her expression changed. Calvin asked who the boy was. She said she didn't know. Calvin knew she was lying. Then she said something that made the mystery even more disturbing. The photograph had supposedly been taken before Calvin was born. That meant the boy standing beside Calvin couldn't be Calvin. Someone had created a photograph involving his identity before he officially existed. Calvin stared at the image and realized that perhaps even the story of his own birth had been manipulated. He could have spent the rest of his life chasing that mystery. But this time, he made a different decision. He put the photograph away. He had learned that truth mattered, but so did living. Not every mystery had to consume him. Not every unanswered question needed to become another mission. Calvin had spent 10 years looking for Isaiah. He found him. Then he spent months uncovering the people who had lied to him. He found them too. But the greatest thing he discovered wasn't the founder network. It wasn't his grandfather. It wasn't the hidden archive. It wasn't even the truth about his father. It was that people can survive what was meant to erase them. Isaiah survived. Darius survived. Caleb survived. Calvin survived. Their family had been fractured by secrets, but they were finally free to rebuild it honestly. And that is what makes Isaiah's story so difficult to forget. For 10 years, Calvin believed his best friend died in combat. He mourned him. He carried the guilt. He accepted the official story because people he trusted told him it was true. But one day, he saw Isaiah alive. And that single moment forced Calvin to question everything. The lesson wasn't simply that people can disappear and return. It was that an official story can become powerful enough to replace reality when nobody questions it. A record can say someone is dead. A commander can confirm it. A family can mourn. Friends can move on. Years can pass. And still, the truth can remain alive somewhere. Isaiah had been alive for 10 years. Calvin just didn't know where to look. Sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the truth. It's accepting that the people you trusted may have been the ones hiding it. Calvin lost 10 years with Isaiah. He couldn't get those years back. But he refused to lose the rest of his life to the same lie. When Isaiah asked him what they should do next, Calvin didn't talk about revenge. He didn't talk about the network. He didn't talk about the director. He simply said, "We live." And perhaps that was the real ending. Not the destruction of the founder network. Not the exposure of the secrets. Not the arrest of the people responsible. It was two best friends standing together after 10 years of believing they would never see each other again. No orders. No lies. No pretending. Just two men who had been given back the one thing the system could never fully take away, the choice to decide what came next. So think about this. If someone you loved was officially declared dead, and 10 years later you suddenly saw them standing alive in front of you, would you immediately run toward them? Or would you first ask yourself who wanted you to believe they were dead? Calvin thought Isaiah was gone forever. He discovered that Isaiah was alive. But finding Isaiah forced him to uncover a truth much larger than one missing soldier. It revealed a family built around secrets, a network built around control, and a lifetime of decisions made in the name of protection. And in the end, Calvin learned something that changed the way he understood everything. Trust does not mean surrendering your ability to question. Love does not give someone permission to control your life. And sometimes, the person everyone says is gone is still somewhere waiting for someone to believe there might be another story. 10 years after Calvin was told his best friend died in combat, he saw Isaiah alive. And from that moment on, Calvin never again accepted a story simply because someone in authority told him it was true. Because sometimes the truth isn't dead. Sometimes it has just been waiting for someone brave enough to find it.